Hello, the story I'm going to tell you today is a story about a very good boy. I'll call him George. He was such a good boy, he always did what he was told. He always remembered what he was told to do. The trouble with George is that he didn't think first about whether it would be the right thing to do at that particular time. Now, George and his family lived at the edge of town, and the grandparents lived just outside town. They had a country place with animals, and oh, it was wonderful to visit there. And George was old enough that he could walk from his house to their house by himself. Now, one day when he was visiting his grandparents, they had been making cookies. Now, I don't really know what flavor cookies they were, so you can imagine your favorite flavor of cookies. And these were not little cookies. These were big cookies, as big as your face. Oh, they were delicious. George ate quite a few of those cookies, but there were some left. And his grandma and grandpa said, "George, would you like to take some cookies home to your family?" And George said, "Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. I'd love to." They said, "Now hold out your hand." You can hold out your hand too. Hold out your hand, they said, and they piled those big cookies in a stack on his hand. They said, "Now, George, be careful taking these home because these cookies are very rich and crumbly. You better be careful how you hold them." George said, "Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes, sir." He put his hand on top of that stack of cookies and he held them tight. What do you think happens to crumbly cookies when you hold them tight? Well, George walked along looking up at the clouds and the birds, and he looked down at the flowers and the bugs, and oh, it was interesting. He didn't even notice that the crumbs of the cookies were falling out between his fingers until he got home and he said, "Mama, Grandma and Grandpa gave me a whole lot of cookies. They said be careful, so I held them tight, and there's nothing left but crumbs." "Crumbs?" said his mama. "Oh, George, you shouldn't have held them tight. You should have put them into something. You know, you could use your hat," because George always wore a great big hat. She said, "You take your hat off and you put the cookies or whatever into the hat, then you put the hat on, and the hat will hold them together while they balance on your head and they won't crumble." And George said, "Thank you, Mama. I'll remember that." And he did too. Of course, next time he was visiting his grandparents, their cow had had so much milk that they used the cream to make homemade ice cream. Now, I don't know what flavor it was, but you can imagine your favorite: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, with nuts and fruit, whatever. You can imagine it. Well, George ate bowl after bowl of ice cream. Oh, it was so good. But there was some left. And they said, "George, would you like to take this ice cream home to your family?" And he said, "Oh, yes, yes, thank you. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir." They said, "Now be careful, George. It's a very hot day." And George thought, and he remembered, "I know what to do." He took off his hat. He scooped the ice cream into his hat. He put the hat on his head, like his mama said, and he walked home. But the hot sun was shining down. Hot, hot. And he felt something kind of trickle down his back. And he felt something go down his face. You know what was happening. The ice cream was melting. When he got home, he said, "Mama, Grandma, and Grandpa gave me some ice cream, but it's all gone. I put it in my hat just like you told me." His mama said, "George, you don't put ice cream in your hat to carry it. You need to freeze it really cold and hard so it won't melt on the way home. What you should do, put it in the sink and surround it with ice until it's really frozen hard. Then you can carry it and it'll be fine. George said, "Thank you, Mama. I'll remember that." And he did too. Now, the next time he visited his grandparents, their dog had had a litter of puppies, and they were so cute. He played with them. Oh my, they were lively. Oh, he had such a good time. And when he was ready to go home, his grandparents said, "George, would you like to take one of those puppies as a pet?" He said, "Oh, thank you. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir." And he picked out the liveliest, the healthiest one, and it was wiggling so hard. They said, "Now, George, you be careful how you get that puppy home." And he thought, and he remembered what his mama told him. So he put the puppy in the sink and he surrounded it with ice. And that puppy got so cold it could hardly wiggle at all. And he easily carried it home. "Mama, look, I have a puppy." And she looked at it and said, "Oh, poor little thing." She took it and she rubbed it with a warm towel and wrapped it up, and she gave it warm milk to drink, and the puppy was all right. But she said, "George, that's not the way to bring a puppy home. What you should do is you should get a piece of string, not too long, not too short, and tie the string carefully around the puppy's neck, not too loose, not too tight, and then put the puppy down gently so it won't be scared. And then when you pull on the string, the puppy will follow you." And George said, "Thank you, Mama. I'll remember that." And he did too. Well, next time he was visiting his grandparents, they were having a barbecue and they cooked a whole rack of ribs. Oh, those ribs smelled so good. And George ate a lot of ribs, but there were still some left. And his grandma and grandpa said, "George, would you like to take some ribs home?" And George said, "Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Oh, that'll be so good." They said, "Now be careful getting them home because we've heard you've had some little problems." And George said, "I know what to do." I bet you know. He took a piece of string, not too long, not too short. He tied it around the ribs, not too loose, not too tight. He put them down gently so they wouldn't be scared. And they weren't. And he grabbed the other end of the string and he pulled, and the ribs followed him. Yes, sir. So did all the dogs and cats who were loose in the neighborhood. Hey, get away. By the time he got home, there was nothing left but rib bones in the string. "Mama," he said, "Grandma, Grandpa gave me some barbecue ribs, but there's nothing left except bones." And she said, "Oh, George, oh, George, look, why don't you stay home while I run some errands? And while I'm out, I'll stop at the grandparents' house and maybe they have some ribs left for us. But while you're here, I want you to be really careful because I've been baking pies for the bake sale and I put them on the back stairs to cool. So if you go out in the backyard to play with your puppy, please be careful to step in the middle of the pies." George said, "Okay, Mama, I'll be careful. Step in the middle of the pies." So Mama went off. And when George went out the back door, sure enough, he saw pies on the stairs going down. And so he very carefully stepped in the middle of each pie. When Mama came home, "Oh, George," she saw the footprints. "Oh, George, we love you very much. And we're glad you try to always do what you were told. But we wish you would learn how to think first." And that's the story of obedient George. Now, obedient means to obey, to do what you're told, and George certainly did, but he didn't think first. It's important to think first. Now, if you wanted to tell that story or act it out, you know the locations: George's house, the road to grandparents' house, 3 locations. And the characters you would need, let me see, there's George and his mama and his grandparents. And I don't suppose you'd have to act out the puppy. You could pretend. Now, how does the story start? At the very beginning, nothing's happening yet, but you say, once there was a boy named George, and he was a very good boy. He always did what he was. So you know where you are and when it was once and who's there at the beginning. And you could say that he lived at the edge of town so that it was easy to walk to visit his grandparents. But nothing's happening yet. The middle of the story, that's the happening part, that starts when George went to visit his grandparents the first time. And you remember the first time they were making cookies. You can hold up your hand because that way you can remember that they piled those big cookies on his hand and told him to be careful, so he held on tight. And you remember as he walked home, looking all around, everything else, he didn't even notice, nothing left but crumbs. And his mama told him what he should have done is he should have put them in his hat. What did he put in his hat? What came next? Ice cream. So after he had bowls of ice cream, he scooped the extra in his hat, and well, what happened on the way home? The sun shining down. And his mama told him what he should have done is he should have packed it with ice to freeze it really hard and cold. And that helps you remember what he brought home next, which was the puppy. Oh, poor puppy, packed in ice. And his mama wrapped it in a warm towel and gave it warm milk, so it was okay. But now, did he carry anything else home? No, his mama gave up with him. Said, now you stay home, but be really careful. Be really careful if you go out the back stairs where the pies for the bake sale are cooling. Be sure to step in the middle of the pies. Now we know she meant don't step in the pie, step in the middle instead. But George thought she meant step in the middle of each pie. Now that's the one tricky bit in telling this story. You have to say it just right. Step in the middle of the pies. Because she meant one thing, but he understood something else. And you remember when she got home, she said, George, we love you very much, but we wish you would learn to think first. And that's the story of obedient George.